It's a great pleasure being here. Thank you all for attending, and I do hope we will have a fruitful conversation on a very complex and troubling topic. Quite often, in the case of Palestine, it is the world of activism and not the world of academia that produces new ideas and new perspective on a conflict that seems to be going on forever and there's no solution in the horizon. It would not be an exaggeration to say that international diplomacy, politicians around the world and politicians over there who are involved in the conflict, and this will be true also about academics of the mainstream and the media over there and here, have lost hope and did not bring any new ideas in the last 25 years of how to end the misery and the suffering of people in general and of the Palestinian people in particular on the ground. Activists, and especially students, in the last 10 years have tried something different. Not because they received instructions or order from anyone, but because of their attempt to approach the issue of Palestine from a new perspective. They have succeeded in providing us activities, such as the one the organizers are participating in, the Israeli Apartheid Week all over the world, which gives you a different perspective on what Israel is all about, what is the conflict all about, and I think it also includes a very interesting new ideas about how to solve the conflict. New ideas about the solutions, such as the one-state solution, the depiction of Israel as an apartheid state. All these notions came actually from activism and not from academia. In fact, if you look at the academia, it usually provided scholarly scaffolding for what the politicians have produced. So academics provided, allegedly, scientific proof to the politicians' assumptions about the conflict in Israel and Palestine. What is the origin of the conflict? Why is the conflict insoluble? And what is the best possible solution? And this paradigm, this perception of the politician was, for many years, and it's still holding on today in mainstream media and academia and politics, is that the conflict in Palestine is a conflict between two national movements that supposedly have a similar attachment to the land and cannot find a reasonable solution, and therefore they need the intervention of a mature grown-up, which surprisingly they are thinking about the United States in this context. And that grown-up should come to Palestine from the Harvard Business School, from the Columbia Department of Political Science, and bring those brilliant theoreticians who would say, well, we know what to do with Palestine. If you have a conflict between two movements, you should divide the land. You should divide the resources, and everything will be all right. And if you don't accept this perception, it means that you're not modern, you're not Western, and you're not well advanced in life. And not surprisingly, from 1947 onwards, it was always the Israelis who accepted partition, and always the Palestinians who thought that the idea of partitioning the homeland was a very colonialist idea with which they cannot live. Always reminds me, and I'm not a religious person, but it's one of the stories I always loved in the Bible, of King Solomon, who had to judge between two mothers. and did not know who was the genuine mother. They both were fighting for mothership of a baby. And he suggested cutting the baby into two. So the real mother said, in this case, I don't care. Give my baby to the other mother, but just don't cut it into two. And there's something similar, I think, in the difference in the attitudes to Palestine in both cases. So this paradigm that looks at the conflict as if at one given moment in history, two national movements suddenly emerged and started fighting for it, produced the ill-fated two-state solution, which produced the ill-fated Oslo process, which brings us to where we are today. But because the idea looked so rational, the idea of partition, the idea of division, the idea of parity, looked so reasonable, so logical. It comes from the world of logic and business. Because it looked so logical, a lot of good people, including Palestinians, bought the rationale. So ever since the peace process started in earnest in 1967, we wasted hours, days, years, good energies, goodwill, on nothing. It's not surprising that there is not one tangible result that can show that these peace efforts have brought peace to anyone. If anything, they brought more destruction, more colonization, more oppression, and more suffering. And yet, there are people among us who go around with Nobel Peace Prizes for that so-called achievement. And I think it's time to think a bit differently about the conflict. And this is where, surprisingly, we have new ideas coming actually from the academia in recent years. They have not invented the wheel. They were using ideas that were already there before. But sometimes, as so many philosophers of knowledge production teach us, a good idea needs also a good historical timing. So some good ideas can be aired and have no relevance or impact, but then they reappear in a different period and suddenly they make sense. And this is what happened, I think, to the paradigm that now begins to be very dominant in the scholarly work on Israel and Palestine. And this is the paradigm of settler-colonialism, which should be a familiar concept to Americans if they know their own history. Settler colonialism is very different from colonialism. Settler colonialists are people who escaped Europe for various reasons, and mostly because they were persecuted. They were under existential danger. They had no hope for living normal life or even living at all in Europe. The house was burning and they were looking for a new house, a new home. But they chose places where other people already lived. So they were not only looking for a home, they were looking for a homeland. And as you know, when they arrived in somebody else's homeland, they were motivated by the logic of elimination. As this is a phrase that was coined by my colleague Patrick Wolf, who unfortunately passed away 12 days ago, who wrote probably the most important work on settler colonialism. He talks about the logic of elimination. That is to say, you cannot hope to build a new life if you don't destroy a life. And you have to ask yourself as a human being, how come people who were victims of human brutality can become so brutal that they have no problem of eliminating another people, as they have done here, as they have done in Australia, New Zealand, Palestine, and South Africa, among other places. The reason is that another logic is working, and it's a very human logic, the logic of dehumanization. In fact, when the great philosophers of the Enlightenment and even the post-Enlightenment had to justify projects of colonization that involved genociding indigenous people, they had first of all to explain that the indigenous people were not human beings. Otherwise, their noble ideas of equality, humanity, democracy, and progress could not have withstood the test of the political project of colonization and elimination of native people. And Zionism very much modeled itself on the same idea. You had to dehumanize the Palestinians before you could think about eliminating the Palestinians, because as a movement you were the victims of persecution in Europe, and because Europe was not safe for you, and because, like all the settler-colonialist movements, you had a one-way ticket from Europe without a return ticket, because there was nowhere to go to back in Europe. So, in the words of one of the great Marxist scholars, Deutsch, you were jumping on a raft, but the raft was already occupied by someone else. So what do? You share the raft, or you throw the people into the sea. Now, by saying that a certain society is settler-colonialist, namely the Israeli society, or by saying that Israel is a settler-colonial state, or that the Zionist movement is a settler-colonialist movement, you don't immediately condemn the project, the state, or the society. Australia is a settler-colonialist state. America is. Brazil is. As is Argentina and Chile. And yet, try to have conferences on Israel as a settler-colonial state. I can tell you from personal experience, in Britain, you will get as high as the Prime Minister's office calling you university. Why do you allow anti-Semitic pro-Nazi conferences to take place on UK campuses? Not that the Prime Minister of Britain knows what settler colonialism is, but he was told that this is very dangerous. Israelis are terrified when they hear Israel is a settler colonialist state, without even realizing this is a very interesting knee reaction by Israel and its friends, who somehow, of course, understands that anything to do with colonialism is not particularly positive in the 21st century. But it's far more important to try and explain, or at least to begin a painful conversation, what does it mean that Zionism was a settler-colonial movement, and that Israel in 2016 is a settler-colonial movement. This is very important. Because as long as you think of yourself as the people who have nowhere else to go, and that the only way that they can survive and even thrive and excel is by obeying the logic of elimination, the dehumanization of the Palestinians would continue with horrific and disastrous consequences, not only for the Palestinians, but for the Middle East as a whole. Now, it has to be two things have to be very clear before I talk about the connection between the Zionist logic of elimination and what we're seeing around us in Syria and Iraq, especially Syria. Two things have to be clear. Elimination does not need to be always physical elimination, namely genocide. In South Africa, the white settler colonialist movement did not genocide the Africans. Elimination there meant apartheid, ethnic cleansing, dispossession, enclaving people in Bantustans, but it was not genocide. Also in Northern Ireland, settler colonialism was not genocide. Also in Rhodesia, it was not. genocide. And also in Palestine. The logic of the Zionist movement was they need as much of Palestine as possible and have in it as few Palestinians as possible. But to downsize the number of Palestinians, you did not always have to resort to drastic means, and definitely you did not have to resort to genocide. The worst moment still in the history of Palestine is 1948. Because in 1948, there were historical circumstances which enabled the settler-colonialist project of Zionism to try and implement the logic of elimination in its most absolute term. The result was the expulsion of half of Palestine's population, the demolition of half of Palestine's villages, and the destruction of half of Palestine's towns. Palestine was nearly eliminated in 1948 and probably would have remained wiped out of memory and history had it not been for the Palestine Liberation Organization and its successful struggle not to liberate Palestine, but to bring it back into our consciousness and back into history in many ways. And people tend to forget it nowadays about the PLO, how successful it was actually in this respect. But the project of settler colonialism, as I said, is not necessarily physical elimination. That's the first thing we have to understand about it. But the other thing we have to understand about it is that it is a perpetual movement. It does not peter out. It does not finish by itself. There will always be somewhere a Palestinian. There will always be a part of Palestine that Israel would feel that it is not in total control of. And as long as this is the issue, you have the danger that the dehumanization would continue. And when this logic of elimination and logic of dehumanization that propelled the Zionist movement actions before 1948, during 1948, and the State of Israel after 1948, when the acts that are being done under this logic receive international legitimacy, when nobody takes Israel to the international court, nobody condemns Israel for its acts of dehumanization and elimination, not surprisingly, in the Middle East as a whole, in the 21st century, we have even a more barbaric, a more inhuman version of elimination and dehumanization unfolding in front of our eyes in places such as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. By this, I don't mean that because of what happened in Palestine, we have the atrocities that we see in front of our eyes today perpetrated in Syria or in Iraq. This is not what I mean. What I mean is that the international community has very little chance of engaging with this brutality, with this inhumanity, because it always legitimized the brutality and inhumanity in Palestine. So for so many people in the Middle East, there is a sense that you can maybe be as lucky as Israel and be in this club of exceptional states that can violate human rights and civil rights on a daily basis and be exempt from any condemnation or any depiction of them as not belonging to the civilized world or the community of civilized nations. So I think that's what is so important about the settler-colonial project, that it continues to operate and it continues to work according to these twin logics that I was talking about, first and foremost because of the international legitimacy, because of the impunity that it can be done with. The only way of actually stopping it, the only way of compensating for the 40, 50 years of the so-called peace process, which was a huge waste of time and energy and human goodwill, the only way of doing it is not only to apply the paradigm of settler colonialism and through that to explain what Israel did in 48, in 67, in 2002 in Ramallah, in 2006 in Lebanon, in 2014 in Gaza. Not only to use it as an analytical tool that tells us we now understand better where the brutality comes from. We now understand better why the peace process was a process going nowhere and totally irrelevant to the reality of the ground. We should also use this paradigm to think about the future. Because otherwise, what's the point of sitting here just analyzing the reasons for suffering and crimes and not talk about possible solutions? And we have certain examples by which settler-colonial projects ended. None of them is too exciting, one should say, but every one of them is better than the reality that existed when they were in full force. We have the example of Zimbabwe, where the settler-colonial project was ended in brutality, in one violent go, where the lands of the settlers were redistributed between the natives through coercion, not through negotiation, and the end result, at least so far, is not very promising. We have the South African model, where the settler-colonialist project ended because of a successful liberation war by the African National Congress, a strong boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign against South Africa, and a negotiated deal which some of us might find a bit disturbing, but one has to face the facts. And the deal was, you can end the political apartheid, which was the backbone of the settler-colonialist project in South Africa, and in return, you'll have to maintain the economic apartheid. Is this going to work? I don't think so, but maybe the economic apartheid will also come to an end, hopefully in the future, and then there is a better chance for the process to be completed. In the north of Ireland, we have similar arrangement, redistribution of resources, and an attempt to reconcile between settlers and the native population. Now, of course, I'm not naive. Who among the Israelis is willing to talk about themselves as settlers apart from the settlers? But they're all settlers. I'm a settler. I'm a third-generation settler. And yet, it doesn't really matter whether the Israelis are willing to accept their depiction as settlers or not. This is not the issue. The question is, can Israel hope to exist in any normal way without eventually the native population or the local population accepting it as a legitimate community? And here is a paradox, which is quite amazing if you think about it. And I thought about this paradox for the first time when I wanted to understand why does Benjamin Netanyahu demand from the weakest Palestinian leader ever, Abu Mazen, why does he demand from this man recognition of Israel as a Jewish state? Did you ask yourself? I mean, Israel can take the West Bank in 5 minutes. They can destroy the Palestine and the Palestinians, especially given what's going on in Syria and Iraq. And of course, there will be some protests here and there, but unfortunately, this logic of elimination can have a very bad ending in the case of Palestine in 2017, 2018. We have to face the truth. But he's worried about Abu Mazen, at the age of 81, telling him, I recognize Israel as a Jewish state. This mayor of Greater Ramallah. Did you ask yourself why? Did you ask yourself why? And the answer is very simple. Settler colonialism in the 21st century can be maintained by power. There's no doubt about it. 250 nuclear weapons, the strongest army in the Middle East, good economic relations with all the multinational cooperation. Economically and militarily, you'll be viable forever. There's no danger there. Israel really is not under economic danger and not under military danger. There's no one in the Arab world that can even scratch Israel's security, especially not Iran, and we all understand it. With all this charade about the Iranian danger and so on, which was meant to win the last elections from Netanyahu. But he wants Abu Mazen to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Because, ironically, these people that Israel can wipe out within 5 minutes are the only people that can give legitimacy to a Jewish state in the Middle East. They are the only ones. Even if the Americans give them, and they do give them legitimacy. If the Western world would give them legitimacy, and they do give them legitimacy. If China would give them legitimacy, and even the Chinese give them legitimacy. If Saudi Arabia and Qatar would give them legitimacy, and they do give them legitimacy. It doesn't help. You still feel insecure. You still say, we have our war of independence. Against whom? We still fight a struggle for survival against the children with kitchen cutlery. We are a state under existential danger. My son told me that every 5 minutes this is being told to him in school in Israel. So he kept asking me, is it true? I said, no, I don't think it is true. I said, you can sleep tonight quite well. I mean, it is your children at your age in Jenin that cannot sleep well tonight, but you can sleep well tonight. This sense of insecurity of the strongest military power in the Middle East has to do with legitimacy. Because every settler-colonial project in the past, and Israel is the only one still existing in the present, is built on two pillars. There is the material pillar, economic power, military power, and that's very difficult to erode. But also a moral pillar. A moral pillar. And that pillar looks very thin in Israel. And this is something the Israelis are aware of. And it's very interesting, and with this I'll come close to an end. It's very interesting to see the Israeli reaction to that moment in history in which they have found themselves. And I think both reactions are very, very natural. Very natural. And I really mean it, I'm not cynical. One reaction says, if anyway I don't have a moral pillar to stand on, I can give up on morality. So they vote for political parties that say, we don't care what the world is saying, we don't care about international legitimacy, we don't care about democracy, we don't care about human rights, but they say it openly. It's part of the political agenda. And more Israelis are voting for these parties, feeling that there's nothing to fear because there's no backlash and there's no dividend from taking the moral high ground, if you want. The second reaction is of many, many young Israelis who leave Israel. That's another way of reacting to such a reality. We have a large group of Israeli Jews who cannot leave. They are too poor. They don't have European passports. They come from Arab countries originally. And in fact, it's our job as activists, whether within Palestine or within the more progressive Jewish camp, is to reach out to these people. We haven't done it. To talk to them. To find a way of understanding their own predicament and include it in what what we may call the new project of liberation of Palestine. Because we have two problems, and with this I would end. That we have not two problems, we have two options that are not working. Fortunately or unfortunately, depends on one's point of view. The Palestinian project of liberation that was built or based on nationalism may have fitted the 50s and the 60s. Not surprisingly, the model for liberating Palestine was the FLN, the liberation movement in Algeria, where the basic idea was you push the settlers back home. This is irrelevant in Palestine. I was told that Ahmadinejad was speaking in this. I'm sorry I wasn't here, because I would have told him, you belong to the 50s, my dear man. This is not going to work. You remember he had this idea, you should go back home. So this demands of the Palestinians to think in a different way on liberation. It's not going to work. Nobody's going back home. There's only one home to all of us, which is Palestine or Israel, or call it what you want. So we have to find a solution within that home for settlers, refugees, and the local population, but not on the basis of the racist regime that Israel is now maintaining. We need a different kind of regime. We need a regime based on human rights, on civil rights, because we need it not only in Israel. We need it in Syria, we need it in Iraq, we need it in Saudi Arabia, and we have to reintroduce Palestine and Israel into the Middle East. And we need a conference not about peace in Israel and Palestine. We need a conference about peace in Syria, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Palestine, and Lebanon. That's the only way forward. And redraw the map that the colonialist powers have created after the First World War to make sure that all the groups that are not represented, all the groups that have been oppressed, all the groups who came from the outside and have nothing to do there, they are all being taken into account in the drawing of a new map that may retain some of the nation states as they are, but may refrain quite a few of them in a different kind of political structure. So nationalism is not working. But also Zionism is not going to work. So we have to find something that is not this and is not the other. And it will be very difficult because both paradigms are very attractive, very powerful in the eyes of both groups. But I can end by saying that the reason these paradigms were so effective until now was because of one of the major successes of the Zionist movement, which was fragmenting the Palestinian people. Fragmentation of Palestine was the greatest success of Zionism. You had Palestinians in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, in Israel, in the refugee camps, and in exilic communities. And each such Palestinian group developed its own agenda. And these agendas did not always fit one another, and it played into the hands of Israel and distanced us from peace and reconciliation. So I think what we need to look now, whether there is a new energy that defragments, that unites. And there is. Because in the age of Facebook, of Twitter, of the computer, you can transcend physical borders such as the wall that Israel has built, such as the barbed wire that surrounds Gaza, or the borders in the north that do not allow connection with refugees in Lebanon and Syria, with Palestinians in Israel and in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The young generation is talking to each other. You can talk in the same day with Gaza, Halil, Haifa, and Hilwe, and New York. And you can discuss together what you have in common. What are your dreams? What are your aspirations? And I think that although it will take time, this is the discourse of the future. And in this respect, a lot of the political structures we see today, both in Israel and Palestine, will not be relevant. Neither the PA, not the Palestinian representation in Israeli Knesset, not the Fatah, not the Hamas. I think all these structures belong to an era where Zionism was not recognized as settler colonialism, and the Palestinian resistance was not recognized as anti-colonialism. We need to decolonize Israel and Palestine for the sake of everyone who lived there and of everyone who was expelled from there. Thank you.